By 1956, a single factory tucked into the river valley of Peru, Illinois, was producing nearly 2 million clocks and watches every single year, and employing over 4,000 Americans to do it. Walk through the gates of the Westclox Manufacturing Company on a Tuesday morning in 1950, and the noise alone would stop you cold. Steel presses pounding, conveyor belts humming, thousands of workers, men and women, bent over assembly lines that seemed to stretch on forever. The air smelled of machine oil and ambition. On those lines, they were building something that every household in America needed. Not a luxury, not a novelty, a necessity, an alarm clock. Over more than 9 decades, this factory in a small Illinois town shaped the way America experienced time itself. At the height of its power, the Westclox empire employed upwards of 5,000 workers at its Peru facility alone. Its flagship product, the Big Ben alarm clock, had sold more than 50 million units. The brand was so deeply embedded in American life that surveys ranked it second only to Timex in name recognition among time products in the entire country. Then something began to go catastrophically wrong. Corporate hands reached in and stripped out the soul of the operation. A foreign technology revolution made the factory's century-old expertise obsolete almost overnight. And on the 31st of March, 1980, after nearly 100 years of continuous operation, the doors closed, permanently. 900 workers walked out and did not come back. Today, portions of that old brick fortress still stand on 5th Street in Peru. Some rooms have been converted into a distillery, others host wedding receptions. A small museum preserves what the factory once was. So how does an American industrial empire that woke up a nation every single morning end up silent? The story of Westclox is the story of American manufacturing itself. It is a story of immigrant ingenuity, dazzling innovation, wartime glory, and a slow-motion collapse that nobody inside those walls saw coming until it was far too late. Welcome inside the Westclox factory, where for nearly a century, time was everything. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. It truly means the world to us and helps us keep making these deep dives into American industrial history. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 1884, Peru, Illinois. The town sat on the south bank of the Illinois River, roughly 100 miles southwest of Chicago. It was a working-class community, built on zinc smelting, coal, and the stubborn ambition of people who had come from somewhere else to make something of themselves. Into that town arrived Charles Stahlberg, an inventor from Waterbury, Connecticut, with a patent concept and very little else. Waterbury was, at that time, the clock-making capital of America. Stahlberg had spent years inside that ecosystem, absorbing its rhythms, studying its machinery, and developing a revolutionary idea. That clock movements could be cast from molded lead alloy, rather than machined from expensive brass. If it worked, it would reduce production costs dramatically and make a precise timepiece affordable to ordinary working families who had never owned one. Nobody in Waterbury wanted to back him, so Stahlberg looked west. He found willing investors in Peru, and on the 23rd of December, 1885, the United Clock Company was formally incorporated in that Illinois river town. A 3-story brick building went up. 25 workers were hired. Production began at roughly 50 clocks per day. The patent Stahlberg had filed, United States Patent Number 326,602, described the use of lead alloy movement plates with inset brass bushings for the gear pivots. It was genuinely innovative. It was also deeply fragile. The early months were brutal. The machinery required constant adjustment. Financing ran thin faster than expected. Stahlberg's lead alloy process was sound in theory, but maddening to execute at scale. By 1887, the United Clock Company had exhausted its capital and was forced to declare bankruptcy. The dream appeared to be over. But here's the thing, it wasn't. A local businessman named Frederick William Matheson had watched the experiment with quiet interest. Matheson was part owner of a zinc smelting plant. He understood metallurgy. He understood manufacturing. and he believed, in a way that Stahlberg's original backers had not, that the core idea was sound. It simply needed proper management and deeper pockets. In 1888, Matheson reorganized the company under the name Westclox Manufacturing Company. He poured in capital. He brought in professional management. He expanded the workforce. And he made a decision that would define the next century. He was going to make clocks that any American worker could afford. The machine was back in motion. This time, it would not stop for nearly 100 years. 1890, Peru, Illinois. Frederick Matheson's name does not appear in most history books. He was not a showman or a self-promoter. He was an industrialist of the old school. Methodical, exacting, deeply committed to the idea that a well-run factory could generate prosperity for an entire community. Under his stewardship, the Westclox Manufacturing Company began to grow in a way that the original founders had only dreamed of. By 1890, the workforce had reached 81 employees. By 1900, it had grown to 245. By 1910, there were 896 workers on the factory floor. The production numbers were equally staggering. By the turn of the century, the company had surpassed 500,000 clocks per year. By 1905, production capacity had reached 1,150,000 units annually, supported by 410 workers. These were not rounding estimates. These were precise figures kept in the ledgers now preserved at the Northern Illinois University Regional History Center in DeKalb. Detailed records that tracked every unit produced, every worker hired, every dollar spent. The factory complex itself grew with the business. What had begun as a single 3-story brick building expanded block by block across the Peru landscape. New machine rooms, new finishing halls, new shipping docks. The Illinois River, which ran nearby, offered both psychological inspiration and practical shipping advantages. Peru was remote enough to have low land costs, but connected enough, via rail, to reach the national market without crippling freight expenses. The company also understood something essential about its customers. They were not wealthy. They were factory workers, farm families, shopkeepers. They did not buy clocks on a whim. They bought them when the product was reliable enough to trust and cheap enough to afford. So the Westclox Manufacturing Company drove costs down relentlessly, not by cutting quality, but by refining its processes until the machinery could do in hours what craftsmen once spent days achieving. The problem was that the company still needed a product that would capture the public's imagination. A clock people would talk about. A clock people would ask for by name. That product was coming, and it would change everything. 1908, Peru, Illinois. Ernest Roth, general manager of the Westclox Manufacturing Company, was a man who understood two things: German engineering and American ambition. He had been born in America but spent time in Germany, absorbing the precision culture of European clockmaking. Around 1905, according to company law, Roth had been dining at a restaurant in New York City when he overheard a stranger, a skilled clockmaker named George Kern, speaking German at the next table. Kern, who had trained at the famous Junghans clock factory in Germany and emigrated to the United States to avoid military conscription, found work in a New York machine shop. Roth recruited him. What Kern and the Westclox engineers developed over the following years was a clock movement of exceptional ingenuity. They received a patent for it in 1908. The movement featured what engineers called a bell-back design, meaning the bell and its striking mechanism were built directly into the case of the clock itself, not attached externally. It was compact, it was loud, it was robust, and it was ready to be given a name. They called it Big Ben. The first Big Bens went on sale in 1909. In that first year alone, the company sold 28,000 units. Walk into a hardware store, a department store, or a general goods shop in 1910 and you would see it. A round, silver-faced clock with peg legs, a bold dial, and a bell that could wake the dead. It sold for $2.50, enforced as a minimum retail price by the company itself, which stamped on early models the warning, "Patents infringed if resold under $2.50. Then, on the 24th of September 1910, a single advertisement ran in the Saturday Evening Post. Big Ben became the first alarm clock ever advertised nationally in America. The response was immediate. Orders flooded in. The factory ramped production, and within a few years, millions of Big Ben clocks had been sold across the country. A smaller companion followed in 1910, the Baby Ben, a travel-sized version with the same reliability and personality, priced for households that wanted something a little more refined. The company still called itself the Western Clock Manufacturing Company, but on the backs of those early Big Bens, a new word had quietly appeared, a word that would eventually name the entire enterprise. That word was Westclox. 1920, Peru, Illinois. Within a decade of Big Ben's national debut, the Western Clock Manufacturing Company had transformed beyond recognition. In 1920 alone, the factory produced 4.1 million clocks and watches, all assembled by a workforce of 1,870 employees. That single figure, 4.1 million in 1 year, represents a scale of American industrial output that is almost impossible to imagine today. The factory complex had expanded dramatically. By the 1920s, according to Sanborn fire maps of the period, the building occupied 3 full city blocks and was pushing outward. A new addition, specifically designed for the Big Ben and Baby Ben production lines, had opened in 1917. A Canadian manufacturing facility was established to serve international markets. By the early 1930s, Westclox would also operate plants in Athens, Georgia, in Ontario, Canada, in Scotland, and in Australia. This was not a regional manufacturer, it was a global one. The product line grew alongside the factory. In 1899, the company had introduced its first pocket watch, an inexpensive, back-winding model intended to be affordable to any working person who needed to know the time. The company called it the America. By 1921, they had added the Pocket Ben pocket watch. By 1923, the Bunky repeating alarm clock was in production. In 1928, the Tiny Tim, a small, time-only travel clock, joined the lineup. And in 1920, production began on luminous clock dials, faces that could glow in the dark. The technology was breathtaking. For the first time, a person could wake at 3 in the morning and see the time without striking a match. It seemed like pure magic. Nobody yet understood the terrible price that magic would demand from the young women painting those dials. The trademark Westclox was officially registered on the 18th of January 1916. The company newsletter, called Tick Talk, launched in 1913 and ran for decades. It chronicled company picnics, employee milestones, production records, and the quiet pride of a factory community that had built something genuinely remarkable. Peru, Illinois was not just a clock town, it was a Westclox town. The factory was its heartbeat, its largest employer, and in many ways, the very reason the community existed as it did. The question was whether the company could survive what came next. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. There are more remarkable chapters ahead in this story, including one that involves something far more dangerous than anyone at the factory was willing to admit. 1920, Ottawa, Illinois, 12 miles north of Peru. The Radium Dial Company had set up operations in Ottawa in 1920, specifically to be closer to its largest customer, Westclox. At the height of production, around 1925, the Radium Dial Company employed approximately 1,000 young women who painted roughly 4,300 clock dials every single day. Their job was to take fine-bristled camel hair brushes, dip them in a mixture of powdered radium and zinc sulfide, and apply that luminous paint to the faces of Big Ben and Baby Ben clocks with absolute precision. The numerals were small, the brushes lost their shape quickly, and the company, which paid the women by the piece, a fraction of a cent per dial, discouraged the use of water or cloth to repoint the bristles, because it wasted the expensive radium paint. So the women were trained to use a technique that dial painters had borrowed from China painters. They put the brush between their lips and drew it through, creating a perfect point. Lip, dip, paint, over and over. Hundreds of times a day, every single day. The women were told the radium paint was harmless. Some were even told it was beneficial to their health. A few reportedly painted their nails with it after their shifts. Their work clothes glowed in the dark. By 1926, the women of Ottawa began showing signs of a disease nobody had a name for yet. Teeth fell out, jawbones deteriorated. The condition would eventually be called radium jaw. Margaret Looney, one of the first women to fall ill, would die. Others followed. Their suffering would eventually contribute to landmark changes in American labor law and establish the foundational concept of worker protection against toxic occupational exposure. Westclox, which contracted out the dial painting rather than performing it in-house, largely escaped the legal firestorm that destroyed the radium dial company's reputation. But traces of radium continued to be used in clock dials through the 1940s and beyond. Luminous dials remained on Big Ben clocks for decades. Here's what nobody inside the Peru factory openly discussed. The women of Ottawa had paid for that soft glow with their lives. And the man who bought the clock for his nightstand never knew. 1931, New York City. The Great Depression had arrived with the force of a hammer blow across American industry. Sales were falling, credit was tightening. Companies that had seemed invincible were folding. In this climate, the Western Clock Company, by then simply called the Western Clock Company after its name was shortened in 1912, made a decision that would define its structure for the next 4 decades. On the 1st of January, 1931, the stockholders of the Western Clock Company and the stockholders of the Seth Thomas Clock Company formally approved a merger. The two companies became divisions of a newly created holding company called General Time Instruments Corporation. Seth E. Thomas, great-grandson of the original founder of the Seth Thomas Clock Company, became the first chairman of the board, a title he would hold until his death in 1932. It was, on paper, a marriage of equals. In practice, it was an act of survival. The clock industry was consolidating rapidly, and the two companies determined that together they were stronger than apart. Western Clock brought its volume manufacturing capabilities and its global distribution network. Seth Thomas brought its prestige, its New England craftsmanship heritage, and its century-long reputation for quality. In 1936, the Western Clock Division was officially renamed the Westclox Division of General Time Corporation, formalizing the brand name that had been appearing on clock faces for nearly 3 decades. The company adapted well to the Depression years, in part because its products were precisely what a cash-strapped household needed: affordable, durable, reliable. A Big Ben clock was not a luxury, it was a working man's tool. In 1938, Westclox introduced its first portable travel alarm clock, expanding the product line for a market that was beginning to move around more. Meanwhile, the factory in Peru continued to expand. New buildings, new machinery, new production lines. But something was gathering on the horizon that would temporarily transform Westclox into something nobody had ever anticipated: a weapons manufacturer. The Second World War was coming, and when it arrived, it would change every factory in America. Westclox would not be an exception. The alarm clocks would stop, and in their place, something far more lethal would roll off those assembly lines. 1942. Peru, Illinois. On a cold morning in early 1942, The line workers of the Westclox division of General Time Corporation reported to their stations and found something extraordinary. The civilian clock production had been completely halted by government order. The conveyor belts that normally carried Big Bens and Baby Bens now stood quiet. The familiar rhythm of the factory, the presses, the polishing wheels, the dial-setting machines, was being repurposed entirely. America was at war, and Westclox would fight it. Under the direction of the United States War Department, the Peru plant was converted into a precision munitions facility. Westclox became a major manufacturer of fuses for military ordnance, explosive timing devices of extraordinary complexity that required the same kind of micro-precision engineering that had always defined clock manufacturing. The factory also produced compasses for the United States Army and timing components for the United States Navy. The skills that had once kept America punctual were now being channeled into keeping it alive. A small number of civilian clocks did continue to be produced during the war years, beginning in 1943, but these were stripped-down, wartime economy models that contained far less brass than pre-war versions. The Office of Price Management set a ceiling price of $1.65 for these models. They were labelled War Alarm by Westclox, with only the city of origin on the case. No manufacturer's name appeared. They were clocks built for austerity, not for pride. One grandmother in Peru later recalled to a journalist that her own mother had worked on the fuse production line during the war. "She wasn't allowed to say what she was making," the woman said. "She just said she was helping. That was enough." The war changed the women of the factory too. With men gone to service, women filled production roles they had never held before. The factory hummed with female labour. Supervisors were women. Machinists were women. Quality controllers were women. The experience permanently altered what the factory looked like internally and what its workers expected from their employer. Production of civilian models resumed in 1946, and when it did, the country was hungry. Families had been waiting 4 years to buy a new clock. The line that would form around the Big Ben would be enormous. The factory was about to reach the summit of everything it had ever been. 1956, Peru, Illinois. These were the years when the factory seemed like it could never die. Stand on the floor of the Westclox plant in the mid-1950s, and you were standing inside the largest clock manufacturing operation on the planet. 4,000 workers, some sources place the figure closer to 5,000, with various facilities counted, clocked in every morning across the Peru complex. Nearly 2 million timepieces rolled out every year. The Big Ben had exceeded 50 million total units sold. The Baby Ben had passed 28 million. Westclox had plants now in Athens, Georgia, in Ontario, Canada, in Dumbarton, Scotland, in Melbourne, Australia. The name appeared on alarm clocks in kitchen shelves from Saskatchewan to Sydney. It was, without question, a global empire built on the simple mechanical act of waking people up on time. In 1959, the company introduced and patented what it called the drowse alarm, the world's first electrically powered snooze function. The patent was specific. It gave the sleeper either 5 or 10 minutes of additional rest before the alarm sounded again. The rest of the world would eventually call this function by a different name. Today, every smartphone on Earth carries it as a standard feature. Westclox invented it. The moonbeam, introduced in 1952, addressed a problem nobody had previously thought to solve commercially: the needs of people who were hard of hearing. Instead of a bell alarm, the moonbeam used a flashing light to wake the sleeper. It was elegant. It was humane. It sold extremely well. Art Windy, a longtime Westclox employee who returned for a museum reunion event decades later, recalled the sheer variety of products the factory had produced during its prime. "I never realized, even working here, they made so many different models," he said. His wife, Mary Ann, had also worked at the plant. They had met near the factory's drinking fountain. They would be married for nearly 50 years. Stories like theirs were woven into the fabric of Peru itself. Westclox was not merely a factory. It was the place where families were made, where fathers worked and then their sons came to work beside them, where women found independence and income in a town that offered few other options. The company newsletter, TikTok, chronicled all of it: the retirements, the marriages, the promotions, the small dignities of working lives. Then the first tremors appeared, and nobody initially recognized them for what they were. 1968, Arizona. Talley Industries was a defense and aerospace conglomerate headquartered in Phoenix. Its founder, Franz G. Talley, had built a diversified industrial empire by acquiring companies across sectors, cutting costs, and extracting maximum efficiency from acquired assets. In 1968, Talley Industries moved on General Time Corporation, the parent company of Westclox, and successfully acquired enough shareholder votes to take control. The clock company was now owned by men whose core business was aerospace, men who spoke the language of contracts and conglomerates, not the language of mechanical movements and alarm bells. The acquisition was not, in itself, a death sentence, but it marked a fundamental shift in how decisions about Westclox would be made, and who would make them. From the moment Talley Industries took over, the logic that governed the company changed. Peru was no longer simply the heart of the business. It was a line item, a cost center, a facility to be evaluated against alternatives. The workers in Illinois, some of whose families had been at the factory for 3 generations, were now variables in a spreadsheet in Phoenix. In 1972, Westclox introduced its first quartz movement clock, trademarked internally as the Quartz-matic. The timing of this development is significant. The quartz revolution was already underway. Japanese manufacturers, Seiko in particular, had introduced the first commercial quartz wristwatch in 1969. The technology was more accurate than any mechanical movement. It required no winding. It was cheaper to produce at scale. And it was spreading through the consumer market with terrifying speed. Westclox could see the wave coming. What it could not do, under Talley's corporate structure, was respond to it with the speed and commitment required. Meanwhile, the consumer electronics revolution was quietly making the alarm clock itself seem optional. Digital clock radios arrived in American bedrooms in the early 1970s. The clock was now built into the stereo, into the microwave, into the car dashboard. The single-purpose mechanical alarm clock was losing its reason to exist. By 1979, General Time's headquarters had been relocated from Stamford, Connecticut, to Norcross, Georgia. Distance, literal and figurative, was growing between the people who ran the company and the people who built its products. The factory in Peru was running, but it was running out of time. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything and helps us keep bringing these forgotten chapters of American history back to life. The final chapters of the Westclox story are deeply moving and deeply instructive. Let's continue. 1975, Peru, Illinois. The factory was still producing. The workers were still clocking in, but inside the boardrooms of General Time Corporation and Talley Industries, the numbers were telling a darker story. Asian manufacturers, particularly from Japan and Taiwan, had mastered the production of quartz movements at a cost per unit that American labor simply could not match. A quartz clock produced in a Japanese facility cost a fraction of what the same clock cost to make in Peru. The accuracy was superior. the maintenance requirements were essentially zero, and American consumers, who had once been fiercely loyal to the Big Ben on principle, were beginning to price shop. The shift was structural, not cyclical. It would not correct itself when the economy improved. It was permanent. Westclox had invested in quartz technology. Its first quartz movement debuted in 1972, but the transition required a wholesale reimagining of the factory floor, the workforce, and the supply chain. The precision machinery required to manufacture mechanical movements was largely useless for quartz assembly. The skills that a generation of Peru machinists had spent their careers developing were becoming obsolete, and retraining was expensive, slow, and, under Talley's cost-focused management, not a priority. The Seth Thomas factory in Thomaston, Connecticut, would feel this most acutely. In November of 1982, Talley Industries directed that the entire Seth Thomas operation be shuttered and relocated to Athens, Georgia, where it would merge with an existing Westclox facility. The union representing Seth Thomas workers, Local 1082 of the United Auto Workers, filed an unfair labor practice charge with the National Labor Relations Board, claiming the union had not been consulted before the closure was announced. The effort failed. On a Sunday afternoon in April of 1983, residents of Thomaston, Connecticut, held a mock funeral in the town that bore Seth Thomas's name. They marched through the streets in black. They laid a symbolic coffin to rest. It was a remarkable public expression of grief, not for a person, but for a way of life. In Peru, Illinois, the mood was quieter, but the dread was the same. The factory workforce that had stood at 4,000 workers in 1956 had by the late 1970s been reduced dramatically. 900 workers remained by 1980. The end was almost there. The 31st of March, 1980. Peru, Illinois. It was a Tuesday. The final shift at the Westclox factory in Peru ended without ceremony. There was no announcement in the national press, no corporate statement that captured the weight of the moment. 900 workers gathered their things, punched out for the last time, and walked through the gates of a factory that had been in continuous operation since 1888. Most of them had worked there for years. Some had worked there for decades. A few had fathers and grandfathers who had worked those same floors. The factory complex itself was enormous. 665,000 square feet of production space across 16 acres of Illinois Rivertown land. Across the street, a 57,000 square foot administration building stood separately. Together, the complex occupied 11 city blocks. When the company offered the entire property at auction on the 27th of May, 1981, not a single buyer appeared. The building sat empty. Almost a century of continuous production gone. Talley Industries had moved clock and watch manufacturing operations to its facilities in Alabama and Georgia. The Peru complex became surplus real estate, a massive, silent industrial monument to an era of American manufacturing that was closing chapter by chapter across the Midwest and Northeast. Peru was not unique. Gary, Indiana, Youngstown, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, Flint, Michigan. The same story in different industries, in different towns, over and over. The factory closes, the workers stay, the skills become untransferable. The community hollows out around the edges. In 1988, the management of General Time Corporation purchased the company from Talley Industries, taking it private. A brief flicker of hope. But General Time was already in a structurally weakened position. The brand existed. The distribution existed. The manufacturing, at least domestically, did not. The company limped through the late 80s and 1990s as the clock market continued its transformation. Digital, electronic, integrated into every device imaginable. In June of 2001, General Time Corporation announced it was shutting down entirely. The company that had been the largest producer and marketer of alarm, wall, and occasional clocks in North America was finished. The Westclox name, along with the Big Ben and Spartus trademarks, was sold on the 7th of August 2001 to Sultan Incorporated for $9.8 million. A name that had once been worth an empire now sold for the price of a modest office building. 2001, New York City. Leonhard Dreiman, the chief executive officer of Sultan Incorporated, announced the acquisition of the Westclox and Big Ben trademarks with genuine enthusiasm. He pointed to surveys showing that Big Ben and Westclox ranked second only to Timex in American consumer name recognition for time products. He spoke about Sultan's home decor division expanding its position as a leading marketer of timepieces in the United States and Europe. Not once did he mention a factory. Not once did he mention workers. There was nothing to mention. The manufacturing was gone. What Sultan had purchased was not a company in the traditional sense. It was a memory, a set of trademarks attached to a deep, sentimental familiarity that American consumers carried from their childhoods. The name Westclox still meant something to people. The question was whether it could mean enough to sustain a business. The clocks continued to exist. They were manufactured overseas, primarily in Asia, and sold under the familiar Westclox and Big Ben names. Some designs retained the visual language of the original Big Ben: the round face, the prominent bell, the twin peg legs. They were sold in hardware stores and mass-market retailers across the country. A person could still buy a Big Ben alarm clock. It simply bore no connection to the workers of Peru, Illinois. In October of 2007, Sultan sold its entire time products division, including the Westclox and Ingram trademarks, to a company called NYL Holdings, LLC, for an undisclosed amount. NYL Holdings currently maintains the brand from a New York address. The clocks are still sold. The website is still active. The Big Ben name still appears on products available through online retailers. But the old building in Peru sat abandoned. Years passed. A few small businesses moved into corners of the vast industrial space. Plans for redevelopment were proposed and then stalled. The structure that had employed 5,000 Americans at its peak and defined a community for nearly a century stood largely empty, its windows darkening, its corridors silent. Then, in the final hours of 2011, two teenagers walked through an unlocked door carrying a gas can. What happened next would add a final, shattering punctuation mark to the Westclox story. The 31st of December, 2011, Peru, Illinois, 11:56 at night. 4 minutes before midnight, as the rest of America prepared to ring in 2012, the first call came into the Peru Fire Department. The old Westclox factory was burning. Two teenagers, 17-year-old Stephen M. Gallagher of LaSalle, Illinois, and an unnamed 15-year-old from Peru, had broken into the abandoned complex earlier that evening. They found a gas can inside the structure. According to later court testimony, they started the fire out of boredom. The blaze caught quickly in the old, dry timbers and spread through the central section of the building with terrifying speed. What followed was one of the largest fire suppression efforts in LaSalle County history. 40 fire departments were eventually called in. 200 firefighters from surrounding municipalities worked through the night and into the following days. 3 million gallons of water were used in the attempt to bring the fire under control. The blaze smoldered for 5 full days before it was finally extinguished. LaSalle fireman Steve Smith sustained a career-ending injury when a fire hose detached from a hydrant under pressure and the metal coupling struck him in the leg. The damage to his career was permanent. The fire destroyed the central section of the Westclox complex entirely, roughly 25% of the total structure. The north and south wings survived, but the heart of the building, the oldest manufacturing wing, the sections that contained the original brick arches and Victorian-era industrial architecture, was gone. Stephen Gallagher was convicted of aggravated arson on the 11th of October 2012 and sentenced to a term of 6 to 30 years without the possibility of parole. The severity of the sentence was a direct result of both the arson charge and the career-ending injury sustained by Steve Smith. For the former workers of Westclox, many of them still living in Peru and the surrounding towns, the fire was a grief almost impossible to put into words. It was not simply a building that burned, it was the physical proof that their years had mattered. It was the monument to what they had built, and now a portion of it was ash. The two wings that survived still stand today. They have found new purposes. But the Westclox that existed in memory, the humming, pounding, glowing engine of American timekeeping, is gone. Return to Peru today and drive down 5th Street slowly. The brick walls are still there. The north and south wings of the old factory complex rise above the rooftops in a way that still commands attention. A distillery operates in one section, Star Union Spirits, opened in 2017 inside the building that was erected in 1917. There is a pizzeria, an event centre that hosts weddings, and in a corner of the original structure, a small volunteer-run Westclox museum, where former workers and their families come to remember. If you visit, you will find display cases full of Big Ben clocks in every style ever produced. You will find issues of Tick Talk, the factory newsletter, spanning from 1913 to 1971. You will find photographs of 4,000 workers on the factory floor. You will find, if you look closely at an old luminous dial, the faint ghost of the glow that once cost women their lives. 3 lessons live inside those walls. The first is about the relationship between innovation and institution. Westclox succeeded because Charles Stahlberg had a genuine technical idea, and F.W. Matteson had the institutional discipline to turn it into a business. Innovation without management is just invention. It produces a patent and then a bankruptcy, as the United Clock Company demonstrated in 1887. The combination, vision and execution, is what builds an empire. When that combination fractures, no amount of brand recognition saves it. The second is about the cost of distance. When Tally Industries acquired General Time in 1968, the people making the decisions about Westclox's future had never set foot on the factory floor in Peru. Distance produces abstraction. Abstraction produces decisions that optimize for the spreadsheet and devastate the community. Every major wrong turn in the company's decline, the failure to invest aggressively in quartz technology, the decision to outsource production, the eventual closure, was made far from the people it affected most. The third is about the nature of irreversibility. The factory closed on the 31st of March, 1980. The auction in May of 1981 found no buyers. The skills of 4,000 workers scattered. A community built over nearly a century around a single employer does not regenerate in 1 generation, or 2, or 3. Westclox operated for approximately 95 years as a manufacturing concern, from 1885 to 1980. At its peak in 1956, the Peru complex employed 4,000 workers, producing nearly 2 million timepieces per year. By 1980, 900 workers remained. By 2001, there were none. What's left is a name on a clock made somewhere else, sold online to people who remember what a Big Ben sounded like on a childhood nightstand. Some things, once they stop ticking, do not start again.